Our presenter tonight is Ray Szymanski. Ray worked for 4 decades as a senior scientist at the legendary Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of the Roswell crash wreckage, aliens, Men in Black, and the famous Hangar 18. Ray is the author of the Alien Shades of Grey trilogy and is a former Detroit East Sider, is happy to be virtually visiting his former stomping grounds tonight. We are happy you're here too, Ray, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope that my cheesy animation is getting everybody in the mood for a little swamp gas UFO talk. While the animation is concluding, I want to thank Paige Plant for coordinating this event and the Livonia Library for their support, because without them, we would not be here this evening. Now, there's going to be a wide range of information presented here tonight, and I'm confident that beginners and experts alike are all going to learn something new. And the one thing that I'm absolutely positively sure of is that our listeners are an intelligent group, because you have to be in order to navigate the Zoom gauntlet just to get here. And there goes COVID. I've placed a copyright notice on this presentation for your protection rather than mine. If you need snippets of this presentation, please contact me at your convenience, and I'm sure that we can work something out. Now, as I understand it, the Livonia Library will be posting the presentation and making it available for viewing at least for the next 30 days or so. So plenty of time for you all to catch up. Tonight's presentation is principally based upon the final book in the Alien Shades of Grey trilogy, which I expect to publish in the next couple of months. Meanwhile, the first 2 books in that series are available on Amazon and possibly in your local library. Hint, hint, Paige. Every so often, modern history needs to be revised simply because the original authors got it wrong. If we make no effort to correct that false history, then we are doomed to relive those deceptions forever. Now, creating false history or fake news is nothing new. It's been going on for centuries. One such tale of deception has actually been with us for over 900 years. The year is 1066, and King Hector's kingdom is under siege. The French are about to beat his doors down, and his restless peasants are demanding that he do something about all the unidentified flying dragons. With unprecedented clarity, King Hector calls forth his handsomely paid wizard, the great magician Hynek. The king tells Hynek to summon a spell that will make his subjects believe that the unidentified flying dragons are nothing more than planets and stars grouped in unusual formations. Obediently, and because the king is paying him a lot of money, the great magician Hynek waves his magic staff. He then blows smoke into all the proper places and watches as the dragons disappear. Soon, the local peasants are seeing the prancing stars and planets demanded by the king. Unfortunately, the great magician Hynek fails to convince the royal court, and he is banished to Evanston, Illinois forever. In his last breath, he vows to return again someday to continue his evil magic. And 900 years later, he gets his wish. On March 25th, 1966, exactly 55 years ago today, Dr. J. Allen Hynek held a press conference at the Detroit Press Club. At that time, Dr. Hynek was a Northwestern University astrophysicist and a paid consultant to Air Force Project Blue Book. His job was to investigate UFO reports and then explain away those sightings to the public. On March 25th, 1966, Dr. Hynek enlightened over 60 members of the media about the incredible UFO sightings in southeastern Michigan reported during the previous 2 weeks. Dr. Hynek told the frenzied gathering that his press conference would only cover the sightings that occurred in Dexter, Michigan on March 20th and the sightings that occurred in Hillsdale, Michigan on March 21st. Based on a theory that he was given by his colleagues at the University of Michigan's astronomy department, he claimed that the Dexter and Hillsdale sightings were the exclusive result of the spontaneous ignition of marsh gas, or swamp gas, if you will. And although he emphasized to the hysterical media assembled before him that the swamp gas explanation may not explain the other recent Michigan sightings, the damage was done, and the swamp gas explanation was now out into the universe. Now, being a former Michigander, I can tell you, we are people who knows when somebody is blowing swamp gas at them. And we were universally insulted by Dr. Hynek's smug, know-it-all attitude and seemingly baseless investigation results. Equally insulted were U.S. Congressional Representatives Weston Vivian and future U.S. President Gerald Ford, whose constituents flooded their office phones and mailboxes with complaints about the Air Force investigation. Gerald Ford had this to say: "These are incidents which many reliable good citizens felt were sufficient to justify some action by our government, and not the kind of flippant answer that was given by the Air Force when they passed it off as swamp gas." So using those cutting words, Ford wrote letters to his fellow congressmen and quickly gained the support that he needed to drag senior Air Force officials in front of Congress on April 5th, 1966. Pictured here is Frank Manor and his son Ronald, who were the two key witnesses to the Dexter sightings that were smack in the middle of the Michigan hullabaloo. Dr. Hynek is represented in that tiny little yellow box at the bottom of this chart. And although he was the authorized government representative to appear at the press conference, which we just mentioned, he could only say in public what his employers permitted him to say. When Representative Gerald Ford said that he wanted better answers than swamp gas, he wanted to hear those answers from the Secretary of the Air Force and not a low-level blue book contractor like Dr. Hynek. Unfortunately, Dr. Hynek, Project Blue Book, and the U.S. Air Force were still stuck with their swamp gas theory at the time they appeared before Congress to testify. They just didn't have time to do more investigation and come up with a better answer. So the testimony that Dr. Brown delivered to Congress on behalf of the Air Force did not reflect the reality of the situation in Hillsdale and Dexter. So what we see here is that Dr. Brown says that the most problematic UFO cases do not lend themselves to an easy explanation. And when that happens, each case is objectively and scientifically analyzed by the staff of Project Blue Book in order to arrive at an identification or an explanation. So just who is this magical Project Blue Book staff that could conjure up intensive analysis at any time that they needed it? They were, in fact, a small office located in the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they were tasked with investigating and explaining UFO sightings. For several years, Project Blue Book was managed by Major Hector Quintanilla, and they were typically staffed with 1 or 2 enlisted members, 1 young officer, and a secretary. Now, although the public at large was under the distinct impression that this group was a crack scientific investigation team capable of intense analysis and scientific investigation, that simply was not true. Sadly, Any sufficient study of Blue Book's official records will show that they operated almost exclusively in a public relations capacity, whose sole purpose was to disinterest the public in the topic of UFOs. It is now my intent to demonstrate by example that Project Blue Book was authoring a false history of the UFO phenomenon, a history that we are now in a position to correct for a very important UFO case. The following are the three legendary cases that I have selected for demonstration: Santa Ana, California, Exeter, New Hampshire, and of course, Michigan's swamp gas UFO. For each case, we're going to introduce the key witnesses and summarize their story. We will discuss the most important evidence and arguments from both sides and then ask the questions. Did Project Blue Book investigate and report the case objectively and scientifically, or did they cover up the truth? And in the end, we will rewrite the history for one of these cases. Now, I want to assure you that the chosen cases were not just cherry-picked because they might support my position on Blue Book's real mission. Rather, what I selected, I considered to be strong cases, ones which Blue Book could not easily explain, and then would be forced into a phase 2 where intense analysis by Blue Book would be required. So evidence-wise, for me, a strong case occurs when several individuals witness the same event at the same time and their individual stories corroborate each other. Now, a good example for the experts, they'll know this, would be the Travis Walton case, where he and 6 other loggers all saw the same UFO at the same time in 1975. And all of them told remarkably similar stories while hooked up to a lie detector. Another example of strong evidence would be clear photographs of a UFO, especially if those photographs are independently authenticated. Availability of event records was also a principal consideration in choosing my cases. There had to be a large number of available critical factoids on both sides of the story that could be put to the test. And finally, I chose cases that were time-wise clustered in order to demonstrate that major UFO stories are not separated by decades, but often only by weeks and months. This type of clustering often adds another level of corroboration to seemingly unrelated events. Let's start with the Santa Ana, California incident. On 3 August 1965, Rex Heflin was a 37-year-old highway maintenance engineer for the Orange County Road Department. He was outside photographing road signs that had been obscured by growing trees and bushes. He suddenly saw a flash of motion on the periphery of his left eye, and then viewed a silvery craft flying slowly from left to right. He estimated the size of the craft to be 30 foot wide. Now, as that flying object crossed in front of him, it seemed to hover, and Heflin photographed it through his windshield as it crossed his line of vision. Now, as the object moved east, Heflin took 2 more photos. He described the object's motion as wobbly and similar to a gyroscope when losing its stability. After the craft departed at high speed, Heflin drove a couple hundred yards towards a ring of black smoke in the air that was left behind by the craft. He got out of his truck and he photographed it. Heflin later testified that the entire episode lasted about 2 minutes. These are copies of the photographs taken by Rex Heflin in the order in which they were taken. You can see the rim of the windshield. Rex claims that he took the first 3 photos in about 20 seconds. Independent tests have been conducted on the same model camera that Rex used, and it has been proven that the camera is capable of producing 3 photos in 15 seconds. So Rex was well within the timeline of the camera's capability. Rather than send out one of their staffers across the country to investigate and possibly saving a few of the taxpayer dollars, Project Blue Book assigned the Santa Ana case to one Captain Charles Wright-Patterson, who was stationed in Los Angeles at Air Force Systems Command. Now, I've reviewed Wright-Patterson's report. It was completed in accordance with Air Force Reg 200-2 and appears to be a very thorough accounting of Heflin's experience. After his lengthy interview with Heflin, which lasted over 3.5 hours, Captain Wright-Patterson endorsed him to Blue Book in his official report as a very credible individual. Now, after this particular news story of Heflin and his photos made their way into the information office for the Secretary of the Air Force, they contacted Project Blue Book because SecAF wanted to make a public statement regarding the story. But Blue Book could not officially originally obtain Heflin's photos for analysis. And Major Quintanilla thought that an analysis of a newspaper photo would return sufficient scientific information to satisfy the Secretary's demands. So Major Quintanilla dutifully sent the newspaper clipping to the Photo Analysis Division for examination. When the Photo Analysis Division stopped laughing, they sent this reply back to Project Blue Book. Analysis of this type of print would be meaningless. You would think as the head of Blue Book, Quintanilla would have known that. Mercifully, the official Blue Book records do not show how SecAF responded to Quintanilla's failure to provide the requested information. This Foreign Technology Division form shows the official Project Blue Book conclusion for the Santa Ana photos. They called it a hoax. Now, unfortunately, the analysis described in Block 11 on the same form is not the scientific analysis that they used to arrive at their conclusion shown in Block 10. The reality of that logic chain is so much more special. This is the complete scientific process that Project Blue Book used to authoritatively declare Rex Heflin's photos a hoax. The Photo Analysis Division used a Model 110A and set the camera's focus to different distances. A photographer's assistant threw a 9-inch vaporizing tray, whatever the heck that is, into the air at a distance directed by the photographer. Photos were taken until such time as 2 photos were produced that were strikingly similar to Heflin's. Very blurry copies of those 2 proof of hoax photos are located in the official Blue Book records, and I have to admit, there is a resemblance between them and the Heflin photos. However, there are undeniable fatal problems with this unscientific debunking approach taken by Blue Book's scientific assistants, and these fatal problems don't require a scientist to understand. Now, any one of the facts listed here is enough to invalidate the science that the Air Force used to declare Heflin a hoaxer. And I believe taken together, they absolutely crush the validity of Blue Book's evidence, analysis, and conclusions. To begin with, the Air Force camera was a Polaroid Model 110A. Heflin's was completely different. It was a Model 101, and as such, they did not have the same technical capabilities. What Blue Book had to do was methodically set the focus to different distances to get the effect that they wanted. And then in their analysis, they falsely accused Heflin of doing the same thing. Well, there's a big problem here. Heflin could not do what he was accused of because his camera did not have a manual focusing capability like Blue Book used to simulate their photos. Now, this inconvenient fact was actually documented in the report that Captain Wright-Patterson submitted to Project Blue Book. The next problem is that the settings on both cameras, which are known from Wright-Patterson's report and Blue Book's report, and compared to each other, the settings are totally different. So the analogy is Just because you can create a fake Renoir painting is not proof that the original Renoir hanging in the Museum Orsay is also a fake. Likewise, using a camera totally unlike the original to create similar photographs does not prove that the originals were faked. And finally, if we want to keep piling on, and oh yes we do, we need to address the elephant in the room. Since Heflin was alone in his truck, Blue Book never made any attempt to address the most important question here. How exactly did Heflin throw an object into the air, get back in his truck, pick up the camera, find the object in a viewfinder, and take a photograph, all before the object fell back to Earth, and then successfully repeat the process twice more? That question is never posed in the Blue Book records because any truthful answer absolutely destroys Blue Book's analysis and conclusions. As a footnote, Rex Heflin's photos have been authenticated several times through the years by highly qualified experts. The latest investigation was in 2000, which used state-of-the-art computer photo analysis technology. It substantiated Heflin's claims of a light source on the bottom of the craft. It also answered investigator questions about the lack of clouds in Heflin's first 3 photos. As the years roll on and the analysis technology improves, the Rex Heflin evidence grows stronger. My opinion is Rex Heflin's stories and photos are authentic. Meanwhile, Blue Book's investigation looks to be anything but objective and scientific. The second case we're going to look at occurred around the quiet town of Exeter, New Hampshire in September of 1965. This event took place in the middle of an extended UFO flap, which began in that area on the 29th of July. That's when the local Air Force Base and law enforcement officials took the first report of unidentified flying objects in the Exeter area. And those UFO sightings in Exeter would last through the very end of the year. On the left is the Clyde Russell farmhouse. On the right is a young man named Norman Muscarello. On September 3rd, 1965, precisely 1 month after Rex Heflin snapped his famous UFO photos in Santa Ana, UFOs made a big splash right there in Exeter, New Hampshire. It was around 2 a.m. and 19-year-old Norman Muscarello was walking up Amesbury Road, also known as Route 50 in New Hampshire. He was hitchhiking into nearby Exeter, where he lived with his mother. As he approached the Clyde Russell farmhouse, he was met with a 90-foot wide craft with red flashing lights. The UFO closely hovered over the farmhouse and garage. Afraid that this thing was going to crush him, he ran across the road and he dove into the ditch on the other side. When he did so, the object retreated to the rear of the Russell property. When the UFO disappeared, Norman got up and eventually caught a ride back into town to the police station. At the police station, he told his story to the desk sergeant, Reginald Scratch Tolan. Scratch could see that Norman was really shook up, and he knew that Norman didn't get that way ever. When Officer Eugene Bertrand returned to the station, Officer Tolan directed him to take Muscarello back to the Clyde Russell farmhouse and have a look around. Officer Hunt, who's appearing there in the middle of the picture, will enter the story momentarily. So Officer Bertrand took Muscarello back to the scene of the UFO sighting in his car, in his patrol car. And while they were walking around the field near the Russell farmhouse, Bertrand and Muscarello heard the animals on the adjoining farm raising holy hell. After several fruitless minutes searching for the UFO, they were about to leave the scene when it suddenly returned with its red flashing lights. Officer Bertrand's first impulse was to pull his service revolver from its holster and point it at the massive glowing object. Quickly realizing the futility of his actions, he holstered the gun, grabbed Norman, and both ran back towards the patrol car. Bertrand grabbed the radio microphone in the car and yelled to Officer Tolan, "Scratch, I see the damn thing myself." And as this was unfolding, Patrolman David Hunt pulled up in his patrol car. He, Bertrand, and Muscarello all stood there for at least 10 minutes, watching the 90-foot wide UFO hover less than 200 feet away and only 100 feet overhead. The craft then slowly moved eastward towards the town of Hampton. Shortly thereafter, alerted by a citizen witness in Hampton, Corporal Rand of the Hampton Police called nearby Pease Air Force Base to report that citizen's UFO sighting. Now, Pease Air Force Base officials were quick to send Project Blue Book details of these UFO encounters. They were immediately directed to do whatever it took to keep the story under wraps until Blue Book could send out its own investigators. Apparently lacking the finely honed cover-up and investigating skills of the Project Blue Book staff, Pease officials went into full Keystone Cops mode. The very first thing they did was gather Muscarello, Hunt, Bertrand, and Tolan into a room and told them not to discuss this with anybody. Too late. The Manchester Union newspaper had already interviewed them. Realizing that they were a step behind, Air Force personnel went everywhere those newspapers were supposed to be, and they tried to scoop them up. Too late again. The story was a sensation in town. Trying to get Muscarello to recant his story, Pease officials went to Muscarello's home, threatened him and his mother. Muscarello was not intimidated, and he threw them out of the house. Then he let the local police and press know about it. As the days went on and many other sightings were reported, neighborhoods started UFO watches in countryside fields. Hoping to dispel the crowds and their interest in UFOs, a major and a colonel from Pease Air Force Base descended upon one of these gatherings. The colonel sent the major back to the base to get the operations personnel to toggle the base landing lights on and off several times so that the colonel could explain to the UFO watchers in the field that it was the landing lights from the base that they were actually seeing. When the major returned and told the colonel that he'd done exactly what was requested, the crowd agreed they'd seen nothing. The gathered crowd then got in the face of the Pease Air Force Base representatives, who wisely beat a hasty retreat. During the Exeter UFO drama, a story appeared in the press that Pease Air Force Base officials openly supported. The article claimed that many of the sightings could be explained by a flying advertising sign owned by the Skylight Advertising Company, which was lighted during evening flight. Well, that theory was quickly shot out of the sky by UFO investigator Raymond Fowler. He contacted Skylight's manager to discover that the flying sign had been grounded for several weeks and could not possibly be the cause of all the excitement. At this point, the incident at Exeter had entered the problematic stage, and Blue Book's crack scientific team was forced to unleash its objective and scientific analysis skills onto the case. In a moment of unprecedented clarity and inspiration, Project Blue Book asked Pease Air Force Base officials about possible aircraft activity in the area around the time of the sightings. Pease Air Force Base officials suggested Operation Big Blast Cocoa. I just love that name. It was a refueling exercise that took place between 11:45 p.m. on 2 September and concluded 1 hour later at 12:45 a.m. on 3 September. Pease officials mused this may have been the source of the police officer's UFO encounter. Now, Blue Book know that Muscarello had his first encounter a full 1 hour after Operation Big Blast had ended and all the planes were long gone. But that knowledge did not stop Blue Book from sharing that false explanation with the Secretary of the Air Force. Worse, they sprinkled an almost magical explanation on top of the first one. They told the Secretary of the Air Force, on this particular evening, there were unusual formations of stars and planets contributing to the UFO reports. And without much thought, apparently, Pentagon officials released that Big Blast Coco explanation with the stars and planets sprinkled on the top. Not long after the Pentagon announcement with Coco and the sprinkled stars and planets, Officer Hunt and Bertrand became the target of considerable local ridicule, and they took exception. They decided to go all Michigander on those boys at Project Blue Book, whom they thought were responsible for the humiliating press release that had made their lives miserable. So it took multiple letters from Hunt and Bertrand to the Air Force to convince them that they were seasoned police officers and ones who could easily distinguish between a 90-foot wide, silently hovering UFO only 100 feet overhead from a mind-numbingly loud B-47 that is incapable of both hovering and being silent. In February of 1966, a Pentagon official finally wrote back to Hunt and Bertrand and admitted that the Air Force did not know what those two gentlemen had seen on 3 September 1965. So Blue Book was forced to change their conclusion on the Exeter case to unidentified. Though the apologetic letter to Bertrand and Hunt from the Pentagon was a little salve to place on their wounds, officers Hunt and Bertrand rarely, if ever, discussed their encounter in public ever again. And in an act of final defiance, Blue Book personnel just could not resist the urge to preserve the muddy waters that they had created. Even though they knew 100% that Operation Big Blast had concluded long before Muscarello's first encounter and could not possibly be what caused him to tell his cosmic story, they still listed Operation Big Blast in the analysis section of the official case files as their best possible answer. For those who want to dig deeper into the Exeter case, which is just fabulous, my personal recommendation is this book by John G. Fuller, and you can find copies in used bookstores and on Amazon everywhere. Now, the 1966 Michigan swamp gas UFO is the final case we shall examine here tonight, though we already know the punchline that was provided by the great magician Hynek. Project Blue Book scientific consultant Dr. J. Allen Hynek spent 3 days investigating only 2 of the dozens of UFO sightings over Michigan in late March of 1966. And 55 years ago today, he held a massive press conference to share his findings and his illuminating conclusions. By the next day, the swamp gas story was published in newspapers in 25 states. Within a week, the swamp gas story was published in newspapers in all 50 states and around the world. Now, as you may recall from the beginning of this talk, which may seem like a week ago to some of you, Dr. Hynek's conclusions were met with some well-deserved hostility. So, as in the previous 2 cases, we'll look briefly at the key players, their stories, and the evidence. And we will finish up introducing new evidence and a more historically accurate explanation that will send many of you cheering into the night. When Dr. Hynek came to Michigan, there were hundreds of UFO witnesses willing to come forward and to speak to him. Overwhelmed at that prospect, he quickly decided to limit his brief investigation to 2 specific cases, Dexter and Hillsdale. And in each case, he knew that there were many qualified witnesses, such as law enforcement officers, and they were plentiful. Also, early reports that he was able to read presented some consistency. So he decided the best approach was to concentrate on those two cases only. On 20 March 1966, Frank Manor and his teenage son Ronald were alerted to some unusual activity near their home. Frank told an interviewer, "We ran out on the porch and we saw this thing like a ball of fire. Came out of the west, then dropped down below a clump of trees. We got to about 500 yards, had a blue light on the front, and in the back, a light that kept changing from red to white, like it was rotating, like the light on a police car." He said it was almost flat on the bottom, kind of high and peaked on the top, and the whole thing was wrapped like a light in a halo. The body was a yellowish coral rock, and it looked like it had holes in it, sort of like if you took a piece of cardboard box and split it open. A short time later, Frank and his son were joined by Washtenaw County deputies and other law enforcement officials from the surrounding area, many of whom joined in the pursuit. Turns out when the flashlights touched the area where the UFO was sitting, they'd all saw it, the light from the object became very bright and then went completely out. When it decided to alight, Frank Manor said, "We heard the sound of a whistle, something like a rifle bullet makes when it ricochets off something. Then this object went up in the air, passed directly over us, and disappeared." Well, fortunately for Frank Manor and his son, several police officers had encounters on or near the Manor farmhouse during the 5-hour period that the search was being conducted, and they filed reports on those experiences. It's also noteworthy that some of these sightings were not over swampland, but directly over the police and their vehicles. One such case is Patrolman Robert Honeywell of the Dexter Village Police Department, and he did file a report on his encounter. Honeywell said that while Dexter Police Chief Robert Taylor, Patrolman Nolan Lee, and sheriff's deputies entered the Manor search area, he was parked at the edge of that search area at the Quigley Brand intersection, and we're going to see that momentarily. The object suddenly appeared over his car at an elevation of 1,000 feet. It had red and white lights on it. It hovered over the scout car, then made continuing sweeps over the swamp area where the object had first been reported down. He watched it for 10 minutes before, surprisingly, it was joined by 3 other objects. They grouped into a set of 4, and then they disappeared. The area outlined in purple is where Frank Manor, his son, and several police officers encountered UFOs on March 20th in Dexter Township. The red M is where Frank Manor's house is located, and the red H is where Honeywell was parked at that intersection. The distance between the Manor home and Officer Honeywell's patrol car was only about a half a mile. Now, considering that Officer Honeywell had his encounter at the exact same time that all the other guys were in the marshland chasing UFOs, it's a safe bet that what Honeywell saw were the same objects being pursued just moments before. On March 21st, 1966, the very next evening after the Dexter, Michigan case, the girls in McIntyre residence at Hillsdale College saw flashing lights hovering over the Arboretum. They called William Van Horn, the Hillsdale County Civil Defense Director, to investigate. From the second floor of the hall, Van Horn and the co-eds watched as a brightly lit object slowly rose, then fell over the Arboretum. Van Horn reported seeing a convex shape to the object whenever one of its rear-facing lights was illuminated. 2 Hillsdale police officers, Harold Hess and Jerry Wise, saw the same object. Afterwards, in an interview, Officer Hess said, "It wasn't a chopper. There was no humming. We observed it for several minutes. The lights split into 2 and went in opposite directions. This action also damaged the equipment in our patrol car, so when we turned on the radio, we only got static." Witnesses that night included 87 Hillsdale College co-eds who watched these lights for at least 4 hours. Now, during his infamous swamp gas UFO press conference, Hynek proposed that flares set by hoaxsters, the moon, the planet Venus, were all part of the Dexter-Hillsdale UFO solution set. Meanwhile, pretty much everyone in the state of Michigan disagreed with him. Now, to be fair, not all of this was Hynek's fault. To conduct a thorough investigation, one which would actually involve some real science, he would have needed weeks to investigate, not just 3 days. Now, political pressure from above was also affecting the investigation. Dr. Hynek and Project Blue Book were under intense pressure by Congress to immediately explain what was going on, so they had to artificially limit the amount of time they used to investigate. In fact, on the 24th of March, Major Quintanilla received a direct phone call from Michigan Representative Weston Vivian wanting to know everything that Quintanilla knew at that point in the investigation. So, despite the time constraints and congressional pressures, Dr. Hynek made several grave errors which witnesses reported to the press in the days following his conference. They claimed that Hynek did not depose the best witnesses. Frank Manners said Hynek barely spent any time with him. He also said Hynek never interviewed his son Ronald. Frank and Ronald were the 2 key witnesses to Dexter. Civil Defense Director William Van Horn said Hynek would not spend any time with him. Van Horn watched the object in Hillsdale for 4 hours and on and on. In fact, when Hynek wrote his report, he said, people only saw lights. Well, the problem with that is the witnesses said Hynek only chose to speak to witnesses who said they saw lights. He did not want to speak to witnesses who claimed that they saw objects. Now, the most inspired magic that Dr. Hynek used in his investigation report was creating a perfect weather forecast, one that favored the generation and ignition of swamp gas on March 20th and 21st. Nothing could be further from the truth. Based upon numerous historical weather sources, it would have been impossible for swamp gas to form, ignite, and do any of those feats of magic that Dr. Hynek had ascribed to it. Right now, it should be clear as a crystal ball that when confronted with confounding, problematic UFO cases like the 3 that we just reviewed, Project Blue Book abandoned objective and scientific analysis. Instead, they favored throwing random things at the wall just to see what would stick. And now it's time for another perspective. The individual who was about to provide testimony had an incredible 30-year military career. He retired as a full-bird colonel in November of 1987. He had 5,193 flying hours during his long and illustrious career, many of those in combat. Of those hours, 4,218 were spent piloting America's latest and greatest fighter interceptors. Those planes include the F-4E Phantom and the F-106A Delta Dart, both capable at traveling twice the speed of sound. That's over 1,400 miles an hour. That's slightly faster than the guy was driving down I-75 today that I read in your local press release down there in Michigan. My guy is a bona fide military hero, having won the Distinguished Flying Cross, as well as dozens of other decorations for heroism, bravery, and his exceptional piloting skills. His official military records document the fact that he was stationed at Selfridge Air Force Base from January 1965 until January of 1967. During his assignment to Selfridge, he was assigned to the Air Defense Command and regularly stood on interceptor alert. In late March of 1966, while standing on 5-minute alert, the military air defense authorities detected an intruder in the southeastern Michigan airspace that demanded a military response. The Air Defense Command set off the klaxon alarm. Gary and his wingman Bob were up in the air in their F-106s and out over southeastern Michigan in just under 5 minutes. As the first plane in the air, Gary was automatically designated as the flight leader. Gary is now going to read you a prepared statement which summarizes his encounter with an unidentified intruder over the skies of southeastern Michigan in March of 1966. Because his speech has been affected by recent ailments, we will run the text of his statement as the video plays, hopefully in sync. I have been recording interviews with Gary on a regular basis for over a year, and I have verified all the critical elements of his testimony and then some. I prepared the statement that Gary is going to read to you based upon those interviews and verifications. Gary was allowed to make any edits to the statement that he desired, and being a former colonel, you can bet your life that he did just because he could. Exactly 55 years ago today, the world was told that the Michigan UFOs were swamp gas. Tonight, the truth is finally exposed.
I can't hear it, Ray. I'm not sure if other people can.
Did you hear the introductory one?
I could hear you, but I'm not hearing him at all.
Paige?
Yeah.
I'm going to start it from the beginning of the slide and tell people just to read the text if they can't hear it. Okay?
Okay. Well, they can hear you, so.
Okay. Folks, we're having some audio problems. It worked before, we don't know. You watch his lips, read his lips, but read the text, okay? There's plenty of time to read the text, so we'll restart it. I apologize. I don't know what's going on. Act of God, maybe. So I apologize for the lack of audio, but I hope everybody was able to read that, and we'll fix this technical glitch. So what do we know? Well, due to Gary's eyewitness testimony and soon to be released documentation in the book, we now have evidence that pilots from Selfridge Air Force Base intercepted a UFO over the skies of southeastern Michigan in March of 1966. They were definitely not chasing swamp gas at Mach 1.3. The pilots had both visual contact and radar contact, verifying that they had a solid object in their sights. At the end of the intercept mission, the UFO displayed flight capabilities that defied physics as we currently know it and left our fastest jets in its wake. So how does this change the worldview as we now know it? Well, first, every UFO witness in the entire state of Michigan who gave their testimony during the 1966 UFO flap is now officially vindicated. To all of those who were victimized by the swamp gas explanations, your protests have obviously not been in vain. The truth of your experience is now out in the universe, and somebody owes you a big apology. Next, since the swamp gas UFO case is one of the most prominent in the entire history of UFOs, I believe that Gary's narrative is the most significant public UFO admission by an Air Force pilot in over 75 years, and maybe just ever. And finally, the total effect here is that we have just rewritten a small segment of history for the state of Michigan, the US Air Force, and ufology, because those who wrote it the first time got it wrong. Now, hopefully, when Gary's full story is out there in the universe, it will serve as a rallying point for additional disclosure. I thank you for your kind attention. That's all, folks. Next Zoom presentation, y'all can start lining up. The expanded version of this, a little bit more about my pilot. Now that the Air Force has officially approved my book for release, so we'll be able to give you a little bit more on Gary and Bob at that time. I guess we'd like to know if you have any questions. And there's my email for long after if you think of something, you know, tomorrow morning or whenever.